tomb of the giant Gilgamesh finally found. A rectangle sits under a dead river in the Iraqi desert, and for 20 years nobody has been allowed to touch it. That single sentence is the reason this story refuses to die. It sounds like the opening line of a treasure hunt, and in a way it is, except the treasure isn't gold, and the map isn't a scrap of parchment. The map is a 5,000-year-old poem, and the treasure might be the body of the most famous king the ancient world ever produced. Before this video is over, you're going to see the real data, the real instrument readings, and the real reason nobody has dug a single shovel into that ground. You're also going to see the fake skeletons, the fabricated headlines, and the exact moment a genuine scientific find got hijacked by people who wanted a monster instead of a mystery. Stick around, because the true version of this story is stranger than anything the hoaxers invented, and unlike their version, every part of it can actually be checked. Let's start with the man at the center of all this, because before you can understand a tomb, you have to understand who is supposedly buried in it. Gilgamesh is not a modern invention, and he is not a fringe legend cooked up on some forum. He is the central figure of the oldest substantial work of narrative literature that has survived from human history, older than the Iliad, older than the Torah, older than almost anything else still read today. His story was carved into wet clay in a wedge-shaped script called cuneiform, and pieces of it were copied and recopied by scribes across more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian history. Those clay tablets cracked, scattered, and were buried under collapsing cities for millennia before archaeologists dug them back out in the 19th and 20th centuries and slowly, painstakingly, pieced the story back together like the world's hardest puzzle. In that story, Gilgamesh rules the city of Uruk, and Uruk is not fictional. It's a real archaeological site in southern Iraq, known today by the name Uruk, and in its heyday it may have been the largest city human beings had ever built. The epic describes its king as part divine, immensely strong, restless, and larger than life in every sense of the phrase. That description is exactly where the word giant enters the story, and it's worth pausing here because this is the first place where the honest version of the tale and the internet's version of the tale split apart. When an ancient epic tells you its hero is superhumanly large and two-thirds god, that is a literary convention. Ancient cultures all over the world described their founding kings and legendary heroes in exaggerated, larger-than-life terms. It's a way of saying this person mattered, not a forensic description of a skeleton. Keep that in your back pocket, because it becomes very important later when we deal with the images you've probably already seen of enormous bones supposedly pulled from the Iraqi sand. The epic doesn't stop at describing a great king. It follows him through friendship, through the loss of his closest companion, and through a desperate, ultimately failed quest to escape death itself. By the end of the story, Gilgamesh has to accept the one thing no king, however powerful, can outrun. He is going to die, and he is going to be buried like anyone else. And it's the description of that burial, tucked into the closing portion of the epic tradition, that has pulled treasure hunters, historians, and now archaeologists with satellite equipment toward one patch of desert for well over 100 years. According to the ancient account, when Gilgamesh dies, the people of Uruk don't simply dig a grave in the ground. They do something far stranger. They divert the Euphrates River itself, temporarily blocking its flow so that a stretch of the riverbed runs dry. Down in that exposed channel, in the mud where flowing water used to be, they construct a tomb. Once the king is sealed inside, they release the dam and let the river rush back over everything so that the water itself becomes the guardian of the grave, hiding it forever from anyone who might try to disturb it. For thousands of years, scholars treated this as a beautiful piece of poetic imagery, a symbolic return of the hero to the natural world. Nobody expected an actual buried structure to still be sitting there in the 21st century, waiting for someone with the right equipment to notice it. So was Gilgamesh even a real person? Or is this entire chain of reasoning built on a myth with no body behind it at all? This is the fair question skeptics have every right to ask, and the answer is more interesting than a flat yes or no. Among the surviving records from ancient Mesopotamia is a document historians call the Sumerian King List, an ancient administrative record cataloging the rulers of the early cities stretching back into a period where legend and verifiable history blur together. On that list, among the kings of Uruk in the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the name Gilgamesh appears, not as a god, not as folklore, but listed plainly as a ruling king alongside other names that archaeology has since confirmed as genuine historical figures. That doesn't prove every detail of the epic happened exactly as written, but it strongly suggests the character wasn't spun entirely out of thin air. Most historians studying the region now treat Gilgamesh the way they treat other legendary founding figures from the ancient world, probably a real ruler whose life was gradually wrapped in centuries of embellishment until the man and the myth became impossible to fully separate. That matters enormously for this story, because it means the burial description isn't necessarily pure fantasy either. Poets exaggerate strength. Poets exaggerate height and divine parentage and heroic deeds, because that's what poetry does. But damming a river, draining a channel, constructing something in the exposed mud, and then deliberately flooding it back over is an oddly specific, oddly technical detail for a poet to simply invent out of nowhere. It reads less like a flourish and more like folk memory of an actual engineering undertaking, distorted and reshaped after being passed down for centuries before it was ever written down. That's the thread that has kept this idea alive generation after generation, long before anyone had the technology to actually test it. For most of the last century, though, testing it was simply impossible. You cannot excavate a poem. The ruins of ancient Uruk cover an enormous area, and after thousands of years of mud brick collapsing back into the earth it was made from, the entire dead city looks to the untrained eye like little more than a series of low, sun-baked mounds. The Euphrates, meanwhile, has shifted its course many times over the millennia, leaving behind old, buried, silted-in channels threading through and around the ruins. Somewhere in that maze of abandoned riverbeds, the epic claims a tomb was built. Digging blindly across a site that size, trench by trench, hoping to stumble onto one specific structure, could consume 100 years of excavation and still turn up nothing. For generations, the tomb of Gilgamesh remained exactly what skeptics said it was, an unfalsifiable story. You could believe it, you could dismiss it, but you could never actually check. That changed with a piece of equipment that has nothing to do with treasure hunting and everything to do with careful, unglamorous science, the magnetometer. To understand why what it found in 2003 caused such a stir, you need to understand what this instrument actually does, because the technology itself is honestly more fascinating than most of the legends people have piled on top of it. A magnetometer measures the Earth's magnetic field, which is not perfectly uniform everywhere. It flexes very slightly depending on what's buried beneath the surface at any given point. Human construction disturbs that field in measurable ways. A mud brick wall, a fired hearth, a kiln, a hard-packed clay floor, the compacted fill of an old ditch that's silted up over centuries. Each of these has a subtly different magnetic signature than the undisturbed natural soil around it. Fired clay in particular leaves an especially durable trace because the heating and cooling process locks a faint, permanent magnetism into the material that can last for thousands of years. So a city that once fired its bricks, dug its canals, and packed its courtyards leaves behind an invisible fingerprint pressed into the magnetism of the ground itself, one that has nothing to do with treasure and everything to do with the ordinary residue of human construction. The instrument used to read that fingerprint looks almost anticlimactic in person. A lightweight frame, carried at a slow-walking pace across the ground. A sensor mounted a fixed distance above the soil. A small onboard computer logging thousands of readings every second. In the early 2000s, a research team walked that instrument across Uruk in tight, methodical parallel lines, back and forth, day after day, covering enormous stretches of ground without disturbing a single grain of sand. There was nothing dramatic about the actual fieldwork. No trenches, no dramatic reveal in the moment, just patient, repetitive walking under a brutal sun, recording numbers that meant nothing to the naked eye. But when all those readings were compiled and rendered as an image, bright where the magnetic field was strong and dark where it was weak, the buried city reappeared on the screen in astonishing detail. Straight streets emerged. The great enclosing wall of Uruk, the very wall the epic itself boasts about, showed up as a sweeping band cutting across the image. Inside it, building foundations and courtyards and the dense layout of a city that once held tens of thousands of people all came into focus. And threading through everything, unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at, were the canals, their silted beds registering differently from the surrounding earth because the material filling them had settled and compacted in its own distinct way. For the first time, researchers were looking at the layout of one of the oldest true cities on Earth without moving a single spade of dirt. The map alone would have justified the entire survey. But there was one detail that would go on to draw far more attention than anyone on the research team ever intended. The survey extended out past the edges of the built city into the surrounding landscape and along a broad, dark band that the data identified as a former course of the Euphrates, a channel the river had occupied long ago and then abandoned as it shifted elsewhere. The instrument picked up something that didn't look like a canal and didn't look like an ordinary building. It read as a distinct rectangular anomaly, with edges regular enough to suggest deliberate construction rather than the random deposits of moving water. On its own, one rectangle in southern Iraq isn't a miracle. The entire point of the survey was that Uruk is full of buried rectangles because Uruk was a city, and cities are made of buildings. A magnetometer detects shapes, not identities. It cannot tell you who built something, or when, or why, or whether anyone was ever laid to rest inside it. A cautious researcher looking at one more rectangle among hundreds would reasonably file it away as an interesting anomaly worth noting, and nothing more. But someone who already knew the ancient burial account would have felt a chill, because out of every unusual claim in that old story, the strangest and most specific one is exactly this, that the king was not buried in the city, and not buried on high ground, but buried in the exposed bed of the river itself, in a channel deliberately drained and then flooded back over. And here, 4,000 years later, a neutral instrument with no interest in myths or legends had flagged a built-looking rectangular structure sitting inside an abandoned channel of that very river. The overlap between the ancient description and the modern data was genuinely striking, and the researchers were careful, appropriately careful, never to claim it was proof of anything. An anomaly is not an excavation. A correspondence is not a confirmation. But it was there, it was real, and once word of the findings started circulating outside strict academic circles, that careful qualifying language was the very first thing to get dropped. Here's the part of this story that almost never makes it into the sensational versions, and it's the single most important fact in the entire case. Nobody has ever excavated that rectangle. Not then, not since. There has been no trench cut into the old channel, no shaft sunk toward the anomaly, no careful brushing away of silt from a buried threshold. The structure was mapped, catalogued, and then left exactly where it was, untouched, unopened, and completely unproven. The reason for that isn't mysterious or sinister, even though plenty of people have since dressed it up as both. It comes down to timing. The survey was completed in the opening months of 2003. By that spring, southern Iraq had become a war zone. Whatever plans researchers might have had to return with the careful, permitted, well-funded excavation, such a discovery would require dissolved into years of instability that made slow, methodical archaeology all but impossible in the region. You don't bring a delicate, high-profile dig into a landscape where security is uncertain and looting of known archaeological sites was already a documented, serious problem during and after that period. So the rectangle simply stayed exactly where it was, buried under the dry channel, waiting. That ordinary, explainable gap in the timeline is where an entirely different, far less honest story took root. To a certain kind of storyteller, an unexcavated anomaly isn't an unfinished piece of research. It's a locked door, and a locked door practically begs someone to claim they already know what's behind it. So a second, invented chapter got tacked onto the real one. Rumors spread that the war hadn't interrupted the research at all, that it had actually provided cover for it, that soldiers had quietly been sent to the site, that a body had been secretly removed from the channel under cover of the chaos, and that the whole thing had been buried under official denial ever since. To make that version convincing, the story needed a dramatic payoff, so images began circulating. Enormous skeletons half exposed in trenches, skulls the size of boulders, tiny excavators dwarfed beside rib cages the size of small boats, all captioned as the actual bones of the giant Gilgamesh, finally recovered. If you've spent any time online, there's a good chance you've seen at least one of these images shared as fact. They are fabrications. Not disputed, not up for debate among competing theories, simply and cleanly fake. Several of the most widely circulated versions trace back to a digital art and photo manipulation competition, a contest where participants were specifically challenged to create convincing hoax images for fun and skill demonstration. Those winning composite images, well-lit, technically impressive, and designed to look authentic, escaped the context of that contest entirely and began circulating with new captions bolted onto them, claiming to document a real excavation that never happened. None of them show Uruk. None of them show a genuine dig. The giant bones never existed as bones. They existed as digitally layered pixels stitched over unrelated photographs of ordinary excavation sites on the other side of the world. And the supposed military recovery operation, the midnight extraction, the classified transport of a body, has never been backed by a single verifiable document, a single named witness, or a single credible source. It's a story that only works if the tomb was actually opened, and the tomb has never been opened. That single fact quietly dismantles the entire fabricated narrative. It's also worth understanding why anyone trusts a method like this in the first place, because magnetometry isn't some fringe technique invented specifically to chase a legend. Archaeologists have been using magnetic and other non-invasive geophysical surveys for decades to map everything from Roman villas in the English countryside to entire buried neighborhoods of ancient cities across Europe and the Middle East, long before anyone thought to point one at Uruk. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, and magnetometry are now standard tools precisely because they let researchers plan a genuine excavation with far more precision, targeting exactly where a dig is likely to matter instead of gambling on blind trenches across acres of desert. Uruk itself had already been the subject of archaeological attention for well over a century before that 2003 survey, with German-led excavation teams working the site on and off since the late 1800s and slowly building up an understanding of its temples, its famous stepped platforms, and its layout. The magnetometer survey wasn't a lone, isolated stunt. It was the next logical step in a long, credible tradition of studying that city, which is part of why the rectangular anomaly in the old riverbed was taken seriously by the people who found it instead of being dismissed outright. That context matters because it also explains why the researchers who actually did the fieldwork never rushed to call it a tomb. Real archaeology moves slowly and cautiously by design, because the cost of being wrong isn't just embarrassment, it's the potential destruction of a genuinely irreplaceable site if you dig in the wrong place with the wrong assumptions. An anomaly gets flagged, documented, and added to a long list of features worth investigating when the right resources and permissions eventually align. In a stable country with steady funding, that follow-up excavation might have happened within a few years of the original survey. In southern Iraq after 2003, that stability simply never arrived on any predictable timeline, and the items stayed on the list, unexamined, while the rest of the world moved on to other headlines. So if you strip away every hoax, every fake skeleton photo, and every unfounded rumor about secret military operations, what you're left with is smaller than the viral version of this story, but genuinely far more interesting, because it's real. On one side of this puzzle sits an ancient text with an oddly specific, oddly technical burial description that doesn't read like typical poetic exaggeration. On the other side sits a real, peer-reviewed archaeological survey that used legitimate, well-established geophysical methods to detect a rectangular, built-looking structure sitting inside an abandoned channel of the Euphrates, in roughly the kind of location that ancient description points toward. That overlap is documented. It's not a rumor. It's not a hoax. It's sitting in published survey data from a serious research effort. But it's just as important to be honest about the limits of what that data actually shows. A magnetometer reads magnetic contrast in the soil. It does not read names, dates,